Tôi xin trân trọng giới thiệu cái bài trình bày tiếp theo là bài học từ Úc về ứng dụng công nghệ di truyền và nhân giống do giáo sư BIDV, trưởng khoa chăn nuôi và thủy sản Đại học Adelaide trình bày, và bài trình bày sẽ có trong 20 phút. Xin mời giáo sư.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to present to you today. It's a real privilege to be part of this this gathering. I haven't been to Vietnam before, so I got a photo off the internet. But what I want to focus on in this photo is more than just the cow. I want to focus on the fact that she's got a calf, and also want to focus on the fact that my experience in working with animal breeding is that working with the people that are actually involved with the stock is a very important part of what we do. So in this photo, to me, there's a very important part of it is the cow, the calf, and the person that are actually with them. When I teach animal breeding, I talk about the importance of having a really good car. And the thing about a car, a really good car, is that it goes really, really fast. And when we make when we have genetic breeding programs, we want to go as fast as we possibly can. The only thing about that is that if we're going fast, then it increases risk. So it's very, very important to have a very good steering wheel. So we've got to be going in the right direction. So it's not only about speed, it's also about direction. And then the other key thing about the direction is that the reason we're breeding animals is for people. And so actually considering the driver and the driver experience and the whole thing is a very important part of it. And so to me, the most important part of the breeding program is the driver, the direction, and the speed. And I'll touch on some of those things. Just before we get on too much to that, although this relates to the direction of breeding, in a way, this is a very complicated graph, but on the vertical axis, it is a measure of efficiency of a production system. And it is the measure of efficiency is the weight of calf weaned per unit of feed for the cow and the calf. The actual units don't worry too much about. They've then got different slaughter weights. So each curve represents a different slaughter weight. And on the horizontal axis, I've got different levels of mature cow weight or cow size. I started at 400 because I was working on it in Australia with this data, but if we go back to yellow cattle, then it would need to go back further to the left. The point of this is that if you have a very high market requiring a very high carcass weight, then you need big cattle to be efficient. But if the market is just paying on kilograms of meat and you are slaughtering at a particular age rather than a particular weight, then the size of the cow does not affect efficiency. And so whether you have small cows or whether you have big cows, the small cows can be just as efficient as the big cows. And big cows are only more efficient if you have a very heavy carcass weight requirement by the market. So it comes down to what the market actually requires. One of the key traits that we work with is a trait that is a measure that we can do which affects, is a way of describing reproductive performance. And the trait that we use is days to calving. So it's the number of days from when the cow is put with the bull to when she actually calves. And that has two components. One is what is the gestation length? So the green component there, how long from conception to when the calf is born. That has some variation, some genetic variation, but much less genetic variation than the other part, which is how long did it actually take from when the cow was exposed to the bull to when she actually conceived. So that's the yellow part there, the anestrus part. And that is actually the biggest driver of profit in most of our production systems. If we look at the heritability of traits associated with this, we had a big research centre that looked at two key traits that were associated with reproduction, and they were surprisingly highly heritable. Normally, we think of reproduction traits as being lowly heritable, but these two traits were very, very highly heritable. The first one was age at puberty, and in Brahman and composite cattle. So composite cattle are breeds that have been developed from crosses between Brahman and other breeds. The heritability is over 50%. And that means we can make very fast genetic progress in a trait, because when we're estimating breeding values, a lot of the variation that we see is genetic. And so the estimated breeding values are quite accurate, which means we can go quite fast. So it's a trait that is of high economic value, and we can make quite fast progress if we put the effort in. Then the other trait is, and age at puberty is important, because those that reach puberty younger, then when they're joined, they tend to get in calf faster, and then that sets them up the following year to tend to be getting in calf faster and tend to be more productive throughout their life. The second trait that's of importance is postpartum anestrus interval. So this is for heifers that have had their first calf, and they're lactating, and then they're exposed to the bull, or how long does it actually start them to be able to be cycling after they've started lactating. And in composite cattle, the heritability there was 25%. We regard that as quite good. But in Brahman cattle, the heritability was 52%. And so that's, again, very, very highly genetically controlled, and gives us a large opportunity to be able to make genetic progress. It's actually very exciting to have traits that are so closely associated with profit and so highly heritable. We've looked at some other data and looked at a correlation between, or looked at a couple of different traits: days to calving in cows that are lactating, and days to calving in cows that are not lactating. So wet are those that are lactating, dry are those that are not lactating. The heritability of both of those in this population that we looked at was around about 0.2, but the genetic correlation was minus 0.1. So it's saying that the genetic control of the ability for a cow to get back in calf when she's not lactating is basically a different trait to the genetic control for a cow getting back in calf when she is lactating. And ideally, we really want cows to be having a calf every year, which means the trait that we're free to focus on is getting back in calf when they are lactating. One of the other traits that's important in terms of correlations with reproduction, it's not only important for producing bulls that are more fertile, but it's also important because it's associated with fertility in females. And so measuring semen quality characteristics in bulls, and especially young bulls around the time when they reach puberty, that's an important indicator of age at puberty in bulls. And not surprisingly, genetic control of age at puberty in bulls is associated with genetics of age at puberty in females. And so these are important traits. So things that we look at in males are scrotal circumference and some sperm defects. In some projects, the percentage of normal sperm is the most important trait. In other projects, vacuoles and other specific defects are more important. Another thing about cows is that as they go through the cycle of having some good feed and then calving and lactating and maybe ending up with dry feed, they lose condition, and then they gain condition again, and then they lose condition. And so one of the things that we've learned with a number of trials, even in sheep as well as in cattle, is that body condition score in cows and sheep, managing that is very important to be able to manage the productivity of the cows. And then from a genetics point of view, it's important that we actually measure body condition score in cows that have been treated the same and estimate breeding values for cow body condition. It's a trait that is related to younger composition traits, but nowhere near as strongly as what we used to think. And so it's a breeding value that is being introduced now into Australian breeding programs in both cattle and sheep. I spent some time in Kenya many years ago and worked with some breeders there. And one of the things that I realised about the breeders was that they know their sheep and their cattle very, very well. And so I started thinking about, instead of actually measuring some traits, which is very hard out in the villages, if we actually just asked them to be able to rank those animals from best to worst, how bad or good would that be? And what I did was I got some data and I converted it from the actual data to ranks, just from the best to the worst, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sort of thing. I also looked at if they developed those traits into a score from 1 to 5, 3 being average, 1 being best, 5 being worst, or whichever way around. How bad or good would that be? And then I said, well, what about even if you only had a score that only had 3 categories and you just said we've got average animals, we've got above average and below average animals? And what I found was that all of those traits are highly heritable. So the red numbers down the diagonal are the heritabilities, and the bottom left numbers in orange colour are the genetic correlation with the real trait. What that tells me is that we can actually use the people that are working with the cattle all the time, that know those cattle, we can use them to provide some sort of assessment of those animals, and that assessment should actually be a very accurate assessment of those animals, and we can use those scores from those people in our breeding programs, rather than discounting them and thinking that we need to use fancy measures. Sometimes just the people that know the animals better can do a really good job. Another score that we've done in an Australian breeding program was just scoring the hair type on the cattle. Did they have smooth coats or did they have rough coats? And this is associated with resistance to heat and humidity. And when we did the genomics on that, we found that just a visual score from 1 to 5, I don't think there were any 5s in this particular data set, but certainly 1 to 4s. We then did the genomics on that, and we were able to identify a major gene that's associated with hair type, which we know what that gene is, and that's actually been patented by another company. But the point of it is that we can do visual scores on animals that are actually if the visual scores are assigned accurately, then those scores can be very, very good descriptions of the genetics. The fact that we got such a big peak there is a very strong indicator of that. This graph here is designed to show that we can use genomics to be able to describe different groups of animals. And there's a whole range of groups of animals here: Brahman, Afrikaner, Sanapol, Angus. And the genomic analysis has actually been able to separate out the animals that contain different proportions of genes from the different breeds. And so if you're actually starting to select animals within a crossbred population, then you can characterise the progeny in those populations quite well using genomic information. Another project we've been involved with recently is in India, in the state of Kerala, and it's looking at milk production. And they've got a very well-designed government system of semen collection centres and sending semen out to villages, collecting data in villages, and then using that in their selection programs. But Kerala, maybe like Vietnam, has some highland country, and the environment in the highlands is quite temperate. And then they have some lowland country where the environment in the lowlands is quite tropical and so quite extreme for heat and humidity. And so what we did was we looked at the milk data, and they hadn't actually done this before. And we said, well, what's the heritability of milk production in the highlands versus the lowlands? And I was actually expecting this result. And sure enough, in the highlands, the heritability is quite good, 0.28. And in the lowlands, it's actually quite low, 0.13. So not only is the genetic variation in the harsh environment smaller, but also the genetic correlation between those two traits was only 0.07. which means that the production, milk production, genetically, milk production in the tropics, in the lowlands, was virtually a different trait to genetics of milk production in the highlands. Now, they will change their breeding program so that they will actually start selecting bulls even in the highlands for lowland production because they now have this data. So I'll just go through a few points to summarise some of the things I've been talking about. With genomics for multi-breed evaluation, the sort of things that we've been doing is by using genomics, we can account for heterosis and we can manage inbreeding as well. So when we're looking at estimating breeding values on crossbreds, by using genomics, we can separate out the heterosis component or the hybrid vigor from the direct genetic component, which is the bit that gets passed on to the progeny. We believe you should embrace crossbreeding, which has occurred, but also don't blindly keep on doing it. And biggest is not always best. I would argue I'm arguing two things, which are sort of almost opposite, like embrace crossbreeding in some of your populations, but also embrace your adapted and fertile local cattle and develop good systems of measurement that you can then build into your breeding programs. If you're buying cattle from Australia, sorry, Ryan, but I'm a very strong believer in composite cattle. They need to be cattle need to be tropically adapted, but also have genes for growth and fertility and meat quality. So blends of Brahman type cattle with other breeds. So you need sufficient tropical adaptation. You need improved maternal performance, improved early growth, improved meat quality, whatever meat quality is determined by your market. And also by using composites, you'll get faster feedlot growth in the destination country. So once they arrive in Vietnam, then normally that would be the case. To maximise genetic gain, we set up in one of our projects that we had a PhD student just finished, we set up a breeding objective of weaning 5 calves. And we developed a selection index based on the days to calving trait, working towards achieving weaning of 5 calves. So five calves in 5 joinings. And when we did that, the accuracy of the selection index was about 0.35, which is not that high. It's okay, but it's not that high. And so then you think, okay, how can we actually make the car go faster? So we've worked out what the direction is. In this case, it was weaning 5 calves. How do we make the car go faster? And there's 2 answers to that. One is that by using genomic testing, it would increase the speed by at least double, actually more than that, but I'm trying to be conservative here. It should at least double the rate of genetic progress. And then the other thing is that in the nucleus breeding program, to use embryo transfer, whether it be in vitro production of embryos or whether it be multiple ovulation and embryo transfer, some sort of embryo transfer program that also should double the rate of genetic progress. As long as you're actually doing the embryo transfer program from animals that clearly are genetically superior. And then lastly, artificial insemination doesn't really contribute that much to the direction of the breeding program. Really, artificial insemination is useful for disseminating genetics from the breeding program out to the masses, out to the villages or out to the production systems. So it's very important, but not necessarily important to the actual breeding program itself. So just to finish with some messages for Vietnam, the first thing in all breeding programs is to develop a clear breeding objective. What emphasis are you going to put on the different traits? I assume that that'll be things like adaptation, temperament, fertility, growth, muscle, and quality. Develop a breeding nucleus and a performance recording scheme. Capture data from the field. So don't only use data within the nucleus, but actually capture data from performance in the village systems or in the production systems, depending on whether they're commercial systems or village. Develop a system for estimating breeding values, including genomics. Import genetics that are aligned to your breeding objective. And what we've just seen this morning is a very, very large range of breeds that have been imported. And so if there had been a very, very clear breeding objective, there would not have been such a large range of breeds imported, because they're just so different, some of those breeds. And then select animals on the data. Right around the world, lots of breeding programs have lots of data, and then when they actually make their breeding decisions and select the best animals that they're going to use, they don't use the data. So it really sounds like something simple to say, but it's actually very, very important. And then once you're actually making genetic progress, disseminate those superior animals as fast as possible, whether it be to smallholders or whether it be to cooperative systems or whether it be to commercial production systems. So on that, thank you very much for listening.